Hi there, this is Kara with Ice Cream for Buttercream, and today I want to talk about all the different types of flour for baking cakes, plus some mixing methods. Alright, so I just want to go through three of the main types of flour used in baking cakes. There are a ton of different kinds of flours, but we really just are going to go through these three. So the first one is all-purpose flour, the second one is cake flour, and the third is self-rising flour. And these are the most common types of flour used in cake baking, so that's what we're going to talk about today. But first I want to go through a couple of flour warnings. First, it's really important to use the right kind of flour. They're not exactly interchangeable without at least making some adjustments to them. If you use the wrong type of flour, you could have a cake that doesn't rise properly. It could sort of have a gummy texture. There are all kinds of things that could go wrong with it. So it's really important to use the flour that's called for in the recipe. Or you can actually do some substitutions, and we'll talk about that later. Okay, and the second warning is just to make sure that whenever you measure your flour out, you measure it out correctly. And so that just means that you're not scooping into it and packing it into your measuring cup. You want to take one small scoop it out of your flour bag, and then put it into the measuring cup and measure it out that way. If you scoop it directly into your measuring cup, it can pack down the flour, and you'll essentially be adding too much flour into your cake batter, and that's going to cause you a lot of problems as well. Okay, so we'll get started with the different types of flour, and again, I'm not going to go into a whole lot of scientific detail here. We're just going to go through the main points of each type of flour. So the first one is the all-purpose flour. And so all-purpose flour is the most common flour used in cake baking, obviously. It does have a moderate amount of protein content, and it's actually the most versatile flour. The second kind of flour is cake flour, and honestly this is my favorite to use for baking cakes. But cake flour has the lowest amount of protein content, which makes for a more tender cake because there's less gluten development. So technically it can absorb a greater amount of liquid and sugar, which can also make the cake more moist. It is actually usually bleached, and it has a finer texture, and it includes cornstarch, which all-purpose flour does not include. Okay, the third type is self-rising flour, and most cakes don't call for self-rising flour. You do get them on occasion, and sometimes you get the sweetbreads that call for self-rising flour, so I did want to include that. This is basically just flour with baking powder and salt already added in. Okay, for this next portion, I want to talk about mixing flour into your cake batter. And there's a whole bunch of different kinds of mixing methods, but I'm just going to talk about the three main mixing methods, and that's the creaming method, the reverse creaming method, and then what I like to call the dump it method. Okay, so the first method is the creaming method, and this is what is used most often. And basically all this is that you are creaming the room temperature butter with the sugar, and you're whipping it up and incorporating a lot of air, and that's going to help with rise in addition to any like baking soda or baking powder that you add to the cake. So that's the creaming method. After you've whipped up the butter and the sugar together, then you would add in the liquid and dry ingredients alternately. For the reverse creaming method, what you're doing is you are going to put all of your dry ingredients into a bowl, and then you're going to use your room temperature butter and mix that with the dry ingredients. And what that does is the butter is really going to coat the flour mixture, and that kind of stunts the gluten development, so that when you mix in the other ingredients, there's really less chance of you over mixing. So basically what you get out of that is a more tender cake. So after you've mixed your dry ingredients together and then you've coated everything with the butter, then you would add in the liquid mixture, and I usually like to do that in two different parts, but this really gives for a more tender cake. It just makes a huge difference. You can use this method for either all-purpose flour or cake flour. Either one works with this method. Okay, and the third method is what I call the dump it method. I'm sure that's really not the actual term for this method, but that's what I call it anyway. So I use this method mainly for cakes that call for oil instead of just butter, because it's just an easier way to mix things up. And a lot of quick breads muffins and things like that call for this method. So basically all you do is you add up your dry ingredients in one bowl and your liquid ingredients in the other bowl, and then you dump all your liquid ingredients into the dry mixture bowl and then mix it like that. And a lot of times when I do that, you're able to just mix it with a whisk and try, instead of trying to get out your mixer and mixing everything up. So this seems to work better for cakes that have fruit in them, like apple cakes, because they're usually made with oil, stuff like that. Okay, so let's talk about flour substitutions. And I'm going to go through these substitutions pretty quickly here, but if you want to download and print out just sort of a flour substitution cheat sheet, I will put a link in the description below that you can go to. It'll send you straight to the blog post, and then you can just click on the graphic there and it will download automatically, and then you can just print it out and have it handy. So the first substitution is using all-purpose flour instead of cake flour. So let's say you've got cake flour, but the recipe is calling for all-purpose flour. So what you want to do is add 2 tablespoons of cornstarch to every 1 cup of all-purpose flour that the recipe calls for. Alright, next substitution is using all-purpose flour instead of self-rising flour. So let's say you've got a recipe that's calling for self-rising flour, but you actually only have all-purpose flour. No big deal. You're going to add 1.5 teaspoons of baking powder plus 1/4 teaspoon of salt to every cup of all-purpose flour you have. Okay, the next substitution is for using cake flour instead of all-purpose flour. So let's say the recipe calls for all-purpose flour, but you only have cake flour. You want to take 1 cup plus 2 tablespoons of the cake flour and use that for every cup of all-purpose flour that the recipe calls for. Okay, and the last flour substitution is using self-rising flour instead of all-purpose flour. So if the recipe calls for all-purpose flour, but you really only have self-rising, you can do it, but now it starts to get a little bit more complicated. So what you want to do is whatever your recipe says about baking powder and salt, you're going to have to leave that out of what the recipe tells you to add in. You just leave that part out because you're working with self-rising flour and your flour already has that baking powder and salt added to it. So you want to leave that part out of the recipe as long as the recipe calls for about 1/2 to 1 teaspoon of baking powder per 1 cup of flour. So if the recipe is calling for more baking powder than that, you're going to have to add in to make up the difference. You'll have to add in more baking powder actually to make up that difference. So in this case, it can be done. It just starts to get a little bit more complicated. And honestly, I think you should probably just get in the car, drive, and grab some all-purpose flour. It'd probably be a lot easier than trying to figure this whole thing out. But it can be done if you need it to be done. Okay, so I hope this answered some of your questions about the different types of flour used for baking cakes, some mixing methods, and some substitutions for different types of flour. Don't forget to go and grab that printable. It's down in the description below. Just click on that link, go to the blog post, and you can download it by clicking the graphic or the link. Downloads automatically. So don't forget to go and grab that. Thanks for watching, and I will see you next time.